Hello everyone. I hope everyone is doing well this morning or evening, wherever you are. And I hope everyone did appreciate having an extra day to work. If you can hear me okay, let's just do a quick little sound check. Just let me know. Hi Rosalie, welcome. All right, so I noticed that some of you had said that you felt that this week was a little bit easier. You didn't struggle as much, so I was really happy to hear that. Maybe just learning to remember to think about it as a study was a little bit helpful. All right, Susan, thank you. Hi, Jenny. All right, guys. So I haven't had a chance to send out those week 5 and 6 images just yet because I'm still finalizing which ones I'm going to be sending out. But I will get those to you probably by Monday or Tuesday so you guys can get a little bit of a head start on your drawings if you wish. And those, I know I received an email from a few of you about images that you want to paint possibly. So you can go ahead and keep sending those in to me if you want to work on something of your own for the last 2 weeks. Hi, Jody. Okay, good. All right, so let's go ahead and just jump right in because we have quite a few to get through, and as you guys remember, last week was quite long. So Stella, are you in here? So just a little reminder before we jump in. If I pull up your image and there's some color correction or even value correction that needs to be made, just let me know. I'd like to try and get it to that before I start correcting some of your color. And if you have any specific questions, I know some of you sent questions in and I kind of typed those up. If you had a specific question, and I'll address those as we kind of move through. But if you think of something as I'm reviewing it, just type it into the chat box and I'll try and address it while we're working. So let's go ahead and jump in. So Stella, this looks really nice. I think the overall feeling of the her average value. So the trick you guys probably noticed, and this might have been a little easier for you guys to see, on someone who's more medium skin tone, sometimes it's easier for us to see the value structure, whereas someone who's really pale, it's hard for us to see the color, especially because everything is so high key. And in the case with our model here, she has a lot more color in her face to kind of work with and to help you analyze and assess. Now the trick with working from fair, medium, and then you'll notice in our next lesson the darker skin tones, value structure between the average skin tone, what we call the average skin tone, and the highlight becomes more and more distant. And of course, these models aren't falling exactly like medium skin tone. She might be a little bit on the lighter of that scale because even within what we consider a medium range, there's a huge range for people. You could line up 10 people and nobody would have the same exact value or tonality in general. So this is just like a sampling of each, but even within that there's going to be quite a broad range between within the fair skin tone there's going to be a broad range, and within what we consider medium or even dark skin tone. So the key is learning to identify what that average medium skin tone is for that specific model, and then you might or might not have a bigger jump between that and the highlight or the darker areas of the skin. So let's go ahead and take a look here. The only question I have, and I don't think she's here, is just with the picture being maybe a little bit more on the yellow side, but it's really, really close. And so one of the things that I will say, because I noticed this with a few different paintings, is the setting that you put your model in can really influence how you perceive the skin tones. So just looking even at the value difference, if you kind of ignore the color difference between the background and her skin tone. So here we have the background color from the photo reference, and here we have the background color for the painting. And not only is there a value difference, but there's definitely a hue difference. So this is much more kind of like a deep blue purple, and this is much more of a red violet. So if we took this, and I just want to show how it can influence your perception of the skin tones, we're going to take some of that background color and just knock this out. When we're talking about color, relationships between color is huge. You can place the same model with 3 different background colors, and their skin tones are going to not only be influenced by that environment, like we've talked about, but oh, you are here, Stella. Okay. Yeah, so just let me know if some of the color is off in your photo, if you feel like it looks more yellow. I don't know when you just jumped in, but what I was talking about, I'll just kind of recap, is the background and the setting or the environment that you put your model in can really influence how you perceive the skin tones. Oh, okay. All right. So, yeah, you were here, but you forgot to start. Okay. So I just wanted to just show you how if we went with a darker value and also something a little cooler for the background, it really changes how we perceive those skin tones. And you said it's a little on the yellow side, so I'll work on adjusting that really quickly. So we'll take out some of the yellow. Maybe a little bit of the red. How does that look? It's a subtle difference, but I think it looks a little closer to how she feels. Okay. Okay, perfect. So just taking note that your background is going to influence the perception of those skin tones when you're painting. So when I photographed these models, I tried to pick a background that was fairly neutral and something that would complement and be consistent across all the different models that we were painting. So that way we had something kind of steady to compare against. And so I have kind of this backdrop that's kind of a neutral gray. It has a couple of different colors in it, but it tends to work out really well for a broad range of skin tones. But it does influence how we perceive those skin tones. So if I'd put every model against a red backdrop, or if I'd put every model against a blue backdrop, it would influence not only those side planes that we talked about that pick up the environment, but it would also influence how we perceive, the undertones of the model. When we're talking about flesh tones, there's just a lot of different factors that we want to be conscious of and that we want to ask ourselves about. So, and that goes into when you're painting too. So one of the things that could help, I think, in your perception of some of her skin tones and when you're applying them is making sure you get that background nice and dark, for one, because that's going to help with the value structure of your relationships in your skin tones, and then also the hue. So maybe desaturating that color a little bit, making it a little bit cooler, because now you can see it's not competing with that rosy color in her cheek. Really, that color is now one of the most saturated areas in the painting, or her lips, for example. Whereas here, it kind of starts to blend in a little bit. So just think about that. I want everyone to kind of remember to keep thinking about that as you're working. Stella, you just said looking at the painting, yours is a little bit more greenish gray. Okay. Let me just adjust. Do you mean the background is more of a green gray, or do you mean the skin tones? I just want to clarify before we jump into the skin tones. Oh, okay. The model is. So like your photo reference. Okay. All right. We'll get it. We'll clarify it here. So your painting is a little bit more greenish. Okay. So I'll play with that real quick here. Um, Maybe what we need to do is take down a little bit of that pink. We take out some of the red, it definitely goes green, but I'm thinking maybe it's more in here, like taking out some of the pink. That looks pretty close. What do you think? Less saturation? Okay. All right. That looks pretty close to me for as far as skin tones with the photo. Okay, so let's get back to that. Okay, so you can see there's a difference with the background color. So this is from here, and then this was what your background was. And so all you need to do really to get there to there would be to add probably some ultramarine blue, and perhaps a little bit of like the complementary color of a violet. So maybe like a yellow ochre if it went a little bit on the like really saturated violet side. You'll notice like I try to keep mine, it's not always like a perfect match, but I try to keep it more towards neutral if I can, because one thing we want is that our skin tones are really what glow in the painting. So whenever I'm designing my own paintings, it doesn't mean you can't put really saturated colors in your background, but you want to keep them maybe a little bit balanced with the skin tones, because skin tones naturally are kind of like a grayish range. Like we talked about that. They're naturally kind of more neutral. So how do you get them to feel like they're glowing and rich in color? One of the ways to do that is to control the value and the saturation or the chroma of the environment. So everything else kind of plays down just a little bit from those skin tones, especially when we get into areas like here or the lips where we really want to punch up that chroma. So that's one of the tricks I use, because I still do work with a fairly limited palette. The palette we're painting with is the palette I typically paint with, plus or minus a few colors. Occasionally I'll find a need for an alternative color, but pretty much this is the palette I work with, and it's pretty basic, as you guys can tell, but it has a nice diversity, and it works well for skin tones if you learn how to control the colors around the subject. That's going to help enhance your skin tones. Okay, so let's get into some of the skin tones now. So that's just the background there. All right, so I think you got a really close match for her average tonality. I'm going to take the forehead as an example, just because it's a nice big flat plane on her skin tones. Let me pick a different brush here. All right, so there's yours. And then, sorry if you guys can hear that truck. There's someone driving up and down my street. It's a really nice day, so I have the window open. Okay, so here we have her average skin tone. So let me zoom in on that a little bit. Your value structure is almost exactly a match. She might be slightly darker, but that could be just the photograph of your painting. Like it's that slender of a difference. So I think overall maybe she just has a slightly more yellow tonality. Yeah. And you know, you look at your painting in person, because you did say she feels more greenish gray, and that could be what you were trying to say, is that maybe this photo picked up a little more too much pink. But you can see it's very, very close. So you did a great job there. Let's take let's look here now. Let's take like an average, kind of that pink there. So this is her cheek. Sorry, that was the photo reference, so I'll put that there. And then I'm going to try and take something close to the same value. So you're, again, really, really close, but I think in this case, this has maybe a little bit more yellow, and this is a little bit cooler. Whereas in the lights, we needed maybe more yellow ochre. And from down here to get to there, we would want to add probably just a little bit of ultramarine blue to that pink to make it slightly cooler. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that would do it. And it's funny because one of the things I often find when I'm mixing flesh tones is that sometimes if the chroma is just a little too intense, a very, very small touch of ultramarine blue makes a drastic difference. Something like that. So it goes from feeling very kind of hot in color to something that's a little bit more neutral. And sometimes it's the smallest amount of ultramarine blue. But it does tend, you'll find a lot of mixtures are like that. You'll have a red, a yellow, plus your white, of course, and then a very tiny amount of blue, just to desaturate it. Or else sometimes we end up painting people and they look like pumpkins. You know, they're just way too orange. And that blue helps to take that back a little bit. So that but your values are right on the mark. It's really, really good. So that's, I probably said this before, but values are more important in terms of getting the average tonality of the person. So like if you want them to look like a medium skin tone or a dark skin tone or a fair skin tone, you know, value is key. And you'll notice in this week's lessons, I provided 3 downloads of the value structure from each of our photo references, and you can see like what the highlight color is, what the average light color is in terms of value. So I just did it in black and white because I wanted you guys to be able to compare those 3 because we're almost through the darks, you know, we're doing dark skin tones this coming week. So I wanted you guys to see what that distinct difference is. And then after that, we think about, you know, the hue of the color or the undertones of the model, you know, if they have more of a yellow or a neutral or pink undertone. Of course, we have all the other factors that we're thinking about as well. And the key is not to overwhelm yourself. You don't have to know the answer to all of these things. It's just kind of like troubleshooting. So if you're having trouble figuring out what colors to use or what direction to go, it kind of gives you a place to start. You know, you start asking yourself these questions, and then it'll help you start to hone in on what colors you think your mixture should be made of. You know, painting is all about problem solving, and so it's about knowing what the right questions are to ask as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward and let's take a look at that shadow tone. So I'm going to just go for this darker kind of average that you have here in the jaw. All right, so there's your color, and then hers, I would say, is a little bit darker. So that's probably where some of the value difference is pretty key, is that drastic shadow. And part of that is because she is a medium skin tone. Also, if you think about what we had in the previous week with the fair skin model, she had very fair skin, but she was also not wearing a dark top. So remember, thinking back to the environment, if the model is wearing whatever they're wearing, like whatever type of shirt they're wearing, it's going to reflect up into these lower planes. And so, and this model, and also the hair, you know, the hair color can reflect into those side planes as well, especially if someone has a very vibrant hair color. This model, she has dark hair, okay, and a black top, and black absorbs light. So what we have is actually very little, if any, reflected light occurring in here. So it makes for darker shadows, a little bit more of a drastic value difference between her average skin tone, of course, but even the midtones and that shadow value. So if we went darker with your shadow value here, just to show you what that would look like. I'm just going to mass it in. I know there's value differences even within that shadow. And she even has a little bit of it creep up into here to kind of chisel out that cheekbone a little bit further. And it crawls up the back of the jaw there. And then of course her darkest value goes even darker right in here. There's like no light really getting into that plane there. And the same goes when it kind of comes to the back of the neck. But just pushing that value a little bit further, you can see how it creates a little bit more of a dynamic painting, but it also gives her average skin tone a little bit more drama. And you might find as you do that that maybe your average halftone here might need to go a little bit on the darker side. So let me take a sample of that really quick. And I'll mark these out for you so you know in your diagram. So here, let's take that sample. So this is like the transition tone moving from the shadow into the light. And this is often where on someone that has a little bit more of an olive undertone, like she kind of has that, olive, it can be very neutral. But you can see that she has a lot of that green kind of color coming through in her skin in those halftones. I mean, green relative to some of the other colors. But if you look at that alone, it kind of looks like a reddish brown. So if we look at that area, and then we take that same darker tone, you're really close on that one. But yours is maybe just a little bit more red. So here's yours, and so to get there, I would just add a little bit of ultramarine blue and maybe a touch of yellow ochre if it feels too red still. But this is that dark mid-tone next to the shadow. And your shadow color, just shadow, I think adding maybe, you need to go darker, but we need to make it more red, but I think burnt sienna might be a little opaque for something like that. So you might try, if you have it, the transparent oxide and maybe a touch of alizarin. And that should get it, and maybe probably a little bit of ultramarine blue too if those don't work. So I would try that combination. It would help to deepen the color and also give you that richer kind of vibrant shadow. All right. Let's see. This area might be a little on the green side. Hers is just a little bit more, it is a greenish tone, but it's a little bit more. Hold on, I'm going to shut my window. I don't want that sound coming through. There we go. So let me do a quick comparison of that real quick. Just make some room here. Oops. All right, so if we take kind of your halftone down in the lower jaw, and I can see you used it in other parts of the face, but it's most clear down here. And then we take that same area here. Yours just has a little bit too much yellow in it. So that would be a fairly easy fix. I think using maybe some, let's see, it needs a little more red, obviously, because the red will take out some of that green. So maybe a little bit of Cad Red, and I would say blue, ultramarine blue, a very small amount. Of course, you probably have to add white to maintain the value, because your value is actually really close. So I think that would be, it's just shifting the hue a little bit more towards a neutral. And that's going to help to balance out. And it's still going to look green compared to, it's just more maybe of a green-gray. But it'll still look kind of greenish compared to some of these reds that you have in your skin tones. Overall, though, you did a really nice job. Do you have any questions about specific colors or areas you might have struggled with? Yeah, and this is funny. The funny thing about flesh tones, I mean, and we're going to talk about in the last 2 weeks about how you can get away with really kind of wild color in skin tones for like a more creative effect. But when we're talking about just painting someone under like somewhat neutral light, and we're just trying to capture like them as they are in their natural hue, it's really easy if you overdo it in one color. They'll either go like looking like a pumpkin, they're too red or too orange, or they can look sickly if you add too much green or gray. But usually, you know, when you're working on paintings, typically you're working in multiple layers. And so usually those adjustments can be made like and tweaked a little bit. So like if you had a second pass on this one, or you decided you wanted to go back in and rework it, you could easily neutralize these areas, even by just taking a little bit of like a pinkish flesh tone and lightly scumbling it over these areas for like an optical adjustment. Like if you did it kind of semi-transparent, you could probably get it to result in that color. There's different ways, or you can mix the exact color that you want and try and place it there. But remember, these are just color studies, and this is like if I'm doing a commission, or if I'm even when I'm working on something that's maybe a little bit more involved, like a larger painting, and I want to do some head studies, this is kind of the approach I take. And I don't always nail the color, you know, but I might notice, okay, well, I did that this time, so I know when I go into my larger painting or my more finished piece that I'm going to shift these colors this direction. It's like a trial run, essentially. So it's not even about getting at a perfect, you know, likeness, even though, of course, we always like to do that, but really focusing on how all the pieces kind of work together. But really nice work. And let me know if you have any other further questions. All right. Kathy, are you here? Oh, you asked about the sketching. Okay, I'll be sure to check that. Let me make a note for myself. I haven't caught up on all of the forum posts. I saw that there were quite a few in my email inbox this morning. But I'm making a note for myself right now, and I'll try and get to that this evening. All right, Kathy, I know if you're here, just let me know how your painting looks. If not, I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. I do feel like the photo looks a little bit on the orange side, so I'm going to just work on bringing that into a little bit more of a natural range. I think it has too much red. And maybe the curves could be adjusted a little bit. All right, I don't think she's in here, so I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in. Okay, so let me get my color sampler. So you have actually a really nice likeness here. I do feel like the colors are a little more saturated, but I can't quite tell if that's only the photograph of the painting. Did everyone watch the video on the app that you can use on your phone? Someone had mentioned to me that the one I had used in that demonstration when I made it, that app version is like being revised or something. But if you just search in the app stores on your phone, whether you have Android or iPhone or iOS, then you can find different camera apps. There's a lot of them out there. Just kind of do some research, but most of them are going to give you way more options for controlling the color temperature and the exposure. So those are the two main ones when you're trying to photograph your work that you want to pay attention to, is that you can have control over the exposure, which, you know, is how light or dark and blown out the picture, the range is for your photograph, but also the color temperature. Because if you're, let's say you're photographing it under like an incandescent light, like an orange standard light bulb, which tends to come across as yellow, your photograph is going to look really, really yellow. And then if you have one of those apps, you can usually, it'll say like a Kelvin rating or K. It'll say like, you know, 2000 K up to, you know, 5000 K. 5,000, the higher the number, the cooler the light. Natural north light is, I think, around 6,000, 6,500 Kelvin. My studio light that I paint under is around 5,000. And the reason I keep mine around that range is because I find that when I take my work into a gallery, they often have yellow lights. And so I want my painting to read under natural light, but also artificial light. So I kind of find a happy middle, so that my painting will read under different lighting conditions really well. But when it comes to photographing my painting, if I have the light too warm, it can be really hard to capture it because the cameras have a tendency to want to overemphasize that. I've even noticed going into like a gallery show where I have work hanging and I try and snap a picture just with my phone, it never looks like the painting looks in real life because they have those warmer gallery lights on them. And they look great in person, but the camera for some reason really picks up that yellow. So that can make a really big difference in how I'm perceiving your colors as well. So keep that in mind and try and find one of those apps that can work. And there's a lot of them out there that are free. So just kind of do some search and download a few and try them out and see. But those are the two things you want to really look for, is that Kelvin rating, the warm versus cool, and also the exposure. And that's going to give you a better chance at capturing something close to what the painting feels like. Okay, so I just wanted to bring that up because if you're trying to find that exact app that I had mentioned in that video, you might not be able to find it, but there are a lot of similar ones out there. Okay, so I'm going to just start with the average flesh tone. Now from this angle, the other one had a lot more kind of area to work with as far as finding her average flesh tone. And I noticed when I was color mixing, the areas I tended to refer to the most was up here and a little, or somewhere like just below the highlight. And then like an average, like typically the nose has a little more color in it. So I found maybe an area in here, but there's still a difference between the color up here, here, and like down in here. But I'm kind of taking like a survey of, you know, what those average skin tones tend to be close to. So I'm going to just use that point there and then pull something similar here. So I'm thinking, and it could be the photograph, so keep this in mind when you're reviewing this critique. It could be that your photograph is coming across a little bit on the light side. I'm going to pull a little bit from the forehead too, up there, and just make a quick comparison. So what I'm noticing is that, so this was like below the highlight and this was above the highlight on the forehead. Hold on, let me switch these around. I don't want to get confused here. So the colors on the left are yours, and the color on the sorry, the color on the left is from the photo, the color on the right is yours. I'm a little bit tired today, guys, so I'm sorry if I'm fumbling around a little more than usual. Yesterday was a very long day. Okay, so to get from your color here to something like that, you'll notice mostly that there is a big value difference here. So I think the addition of ultramarine blue should do it enough, but if that goes too cool, then you might end up adding like a tiny bit of cad red, and that should give you a little bit more. She does have that kind of olivey undertone, but she's a little bit more neutral, and sometimes, you know, when you're trying to analyze either a photograph of your model or your model in real life, they might not fall 100% into pink undertone or yellow undertone. They might find somewhere in between, and it depends on kind of the zone that you're looking at in the face. But in general, you know, she has a little bit of this pinkish quality, versus I provided another sample of a model that had very clear yellow undertones. So thinking about those things as well, so you can see she has just a little bit more of a rosy quality. So to get from this color again to that average skin tone, I would say the addition of ultramarine blue and cad red, or maybe you could add a little bit of alizarin and get the same or a similar result. You might consider experimenting with that. It kind of depends on where this original color starts. This one is very yellow, so I would say maybe go with the alizarin because it's a blue-red. But you can see that these colors shouldn't be as different, because one of them was taken, this one was taken from, I believe, above the highlight. I'll make a note for you. On the forehead, and this was taken below. Sorry, my handwriting's very, very small there. So try experimenting with some of that, and I think it'll give you a little bit closer color in terms of her average flesh tone. Now you do have a little more richness also in these pinks of the cheek. So let me start with the darker one. So you can see yours is kind of starting off at a very chromatic kind of red, and hers is a little bit more of a soft pink violet. And I noticed even in my painting, I probably oversaturated just a touch in her cheeks. But just keep that in mind as you work. So here I would just say an addition of a little bit of ultramarine blue and maybe alizarin would give you, go from there to there for that dark pink. So this would be right cheek. And I would say something very similar for the left side, and especially because we have this color coming in and influencing. Let me zoom in here on the photo. You can see this color here. It's just like a lighter version of this background color. It's really reflecting into that side plane of her face. We don't get as much of that over here. Here we get more of those kind of greenish halftones, but on this side it really goes towards that purple, and those are some of the subtle differences you want to take note of as you're analyzing. You want to ask yourself, well, why am I getting this color here? You can almost see exactly where that plane changes in the face. You know, remember we have these major plane changes. Here it's falling into shadow. Here it's turning back towards that background. So we're getting, and you can even see it on the side plane of the nose here. It's picking up a slight reflection of that background. So those are things that we want to pay attention to, because it might be one color on this side and a different color on that side. And that can depend too, because you know, if she was turned a little bit more this direction and we weren't seeing this full side plane, let's say we were just barely seeing more of a 3/4 view, you would still start to see a slight shift as it rolls back, but you just wouldn't see as much of it, as a large of an area. It wouldn't be as obvious. But that awareness of that happening, you can even see it in here as this rolls back. You can see that color starting to pick up. So one thing that I think your painting could probably benefit from is emphasizing that side plane there and letting it start to pick up more of that background color and bring the value down. So if I took, you know, a little bit of a sample of that plane change, and then I took a sample of her plane change, and let me just show you, just for kicks, the background color. It's a darker, obviously a much darker version, but it is, you can see that purple tendency, whereas on this side, it goes a little bit more warm and a little more yellowish. So it's just a good observation to make. And that's going to give you a little more dimension too in the form, because that value shift. Okay, so if you have any follow-up questions, just let me know. I think overall this is looking really good. I would just pay attention to that that hue kind of and that chroma intensity as it builds up in your painting. Your painting looks like a medium skin tone model, but she looks much warmer, almost as if if I had taken our model Jasmine and I put her under a really warm light, then she would probably have more colors like you see here. More of it would bring out the warmth in her skin. When I photographed them, I tried to photograph them under something more of a north-facing light, like a cool, natural light, because that's what brings out like the true colors in skin tone, the kind of inherent skin tone colors of the individual. And you can see that definitely in those highlight colors here and here. They take on kind of a coolish tint. But if I had put her under a warm light, it would start to feel a little differently. All right, really nice work. And if you have any follow-up questions, just feel free to email me. All right, Angela, are you here? I think I saw you in here earlier. So I had put your question here because you had a really good one, and I thought it would help everyone else too. So here's one of the challenges of alla prima painting is that you're trying to build up everything in one layer. This can cause you to slide around. If you're working on kind of a slicker surface, you're going to slide around a little bit. But also if you paint too thick in the first pass, and then you try and go back and put on those highlights, it can be really hard to get them to stick. So one thing to remember is to kind of paint thin to thick in terms of like, it's not that you want your under layer to be really washy, but you want it to maybe be a little bit more fluid or not applied nearly as impasto or thick as your highlight colors that you tend to add on top. And another thing that helps is to, when you're kind of transitioning, and let's say you've blocked in all of these colors. Oops. Let me get my ink pen here. So let's say you've blocked in all of these average skin tones, and then you want to place your highlight color on top and not have it disturb or mix into these colors underneath. Try using a large soft brush. So when we apply our paint with the other areas, I was using those nice kind of ivory or the opals. It's like a synthetic hair that's a little bit on the stiffer side. I would switch to maybe a soft natural hair brush. That can help. And then you just really load up your brush a little bit heavier than you would and try to lay it down in 1 or 2 strokes if you can. The more you kind of fuss with it, the more it's going to want to wipe off. And those are some of the tricks that I use to really get those to sit on top. And highlights should feel like they're sitting on top, because if you think about like kind of the three-dimensional nature of the form here, the highlight is hitting those forms that stick out the most. So we think like in a sculptural sense, we have like these forms coming like this way, and then right here, this is sticking the most forward if you were making like a sculpture of her head in terms of planes. These are the points that are sticking out some of the most, if that makes sense, in relationship to the light source, of course, too. So these highlights would move if the light had moved over into a different position. Okay, so let's start off. I hope that helped answer your question. Another thing is, remember these are studies, and so if you're kind of waiting to apply your highlights, you might consider, kind of leaving those areas somewhat blank, or maybe not completely filling them in with color underneath. Or when you get to those areas, and let's say you want to fill in this area kind of around the highlight, what you could fill in around where the highlight's going to sit with this same color, but just apply it thinner. Don't go as like heavy, and that way when you go on top with your bright intense highlights, they really kind of stand out and will sit on the surface a little bit easier. Okay, so let's start to compare some of the color. Now I do feel like the photo of your painting is a little bit on the bright side, so I'm going to bring down some of the brightness here and some of the saturation. That seems a little bit more natural to me. So on a similar note to what I said earlier, having a little bit more, taking more of a careful note of the value of the background can help, and also the temperature, or the hue and chroma. But if we took, let me do this on this layer here. If we took this and really kind of pushed it down into the correct value range, I realize there's some glare here on the hair. I'm sure the hair is plenty dark, but it can adjust how we feel that average skin tone. So you can see now she feels quite bright, especially if we get that. I know this is just glare, but I'm just going to fill it in a little bit darker. So if we really look at that hair value next to that, now you can see how that makes a huge difference in the perception of where her skin tones fall. And if you make your background too light, you might be pushing your values in her skin tones a little bit on the lighter side too. So keep that in mind when you're starting to establish that background color. So let me take a couple of color samples here. So I'm going to start with that average flesh tone up here in the forehead. So it looks like your value range is really, really close. She is just a little bit more pink. Let me take below that highlight too. Not a huge difference. You might be a little bit on the lighter side with her skin tone by a very small amount, and I can't tell if it's just the photograph. That feels pretty nice though. She just has a little bit more of a cool pink influence in her skin, slightly. She does have but I consider her kind of neutral because she has these really yellow areas that kind of pick up like a concentration of kind of more of a yellow base. And it depends on the zone that you're kind of looking at in the face, especially when you start to get down in here. It starts to pick up a little bit more of a yellow color. and not so much of that pink. So it really depends on where we're looking. And I can see you started to push that as well. Like in here, you pushed it a little bit more towards the yellow, and that's good. I think one of the next colors I would probably say needs a little bit of adjusting. Oh, there you are. So you worked from a photo which was a bit yellower than the screen. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so thanks for letting me know, because I know that can influence it as well. One thing that I think would help, Angela, is to take that, you can even leave these skin tones a little bit more on the yellow side, but cool off this halftone. Make it more of like a cool violet red rather than an orange red, and that's going to keep it a little bit less orange feeling overall. So let me show you just as an example what that would look like. So let's say we left the skin tones a little bit more on the yellow side because your print was more yellow, but we went a little bit cooler right in here. And then I'll take maybe a little bit of your average skin tone somewhere in between, kind of find a nice medium. Maybe a little bit darker. Right as it turns, it kind of warms up a little bit, and then she definitely gets that kind of greenish tint down in here. You could probably push the value a little bit too, and that's going to help to enhance the feeling of her being more medium skin tone. On fair skin tone, you do tend to jump somewhat quickly between the shadow and the light, whereas on medium skin tone, you're going to get more of that gradual transition through here, and especially where you get that fall off of light down towards the bottom of the face. I think you're pretty good on this side with that color. That feels pretty good. But again, I think she maybe has a little bit more of a slow transition in this area, so you could push the values in that lower half just a little bit along those plane changes. It's all about those plane changes in the head where we tend to see that shift happen most rapidly. And then a little bit cooler gray color and that transition as it rounds down. And you can see how those kind of changes add up to add a little more of a sculptural quality to her skin tone, and it also makes it feel a little more like a medium skin tone. But I think mostly it's cooling off that cheek just a little bit. You could probably find like a happy middle as well. She does have that cooler kind of pink in here just before that highlight. And then you put that highlight color over the surface. And then her lips, I think the same thing. They're kind of more of a cool, she has these really warm areas, but then overall it picks up more of like a berry color, a little bit on the cooler side for the average like lighter tone, and a little bit deeper, again a little cooler on those underplanes. And you can see how that just subtly shifts her into a little bit more of that neutral flesh tone. And we didn't even change her average skin tone because you were saying your reference was a little bit more on the yellow side when you printed it out. And there is going to be some variability in that, even if you're working from a monitor. Your monitor might be a little more yellow than mine, etc. But you can see how just adding those cool colors and maybe going a little more violet with those halftones, part of that's because it's making her fit into the environment a little bit more too. If she has all that purple around her, it's going to reflect in that skin tone, especially as the planes start to turn. Your shadow color might be a little on the red side, but again, that could be your print. But let's just make a quick comparison here. So there's the reference, and yours, well, yours is somewhere in between here and here. But if I went with this one, you can see how it's just a little bit more on the red side. It'd be a really easy fix. But even if you didn't correct that, I think it would still read better by having those cooler halftones in there. Everything else looks really good though. Do you have any questions? One thing to remember when you're painting those medium flush tones though is keep in mind that value structure for those halftones, because very easily we start to push the light over too far and get too light too soon, and then she starts to feel a little bit more on the pale side. So don't be afraid to push some of those halftone values a little bit darker where you know the form is wrapping away. And it adds that extra dimension. So your question is, should I oil out the background and hair before taking the photo? It dries a bit paler. Yes, so if you have time, you can oil out the background and hair. That definitely does make a difference. Or if you can, try and take a picture of it the same day you painted it. Because it will sink in. I know what you're saying, especially some of the darker colors, when you use alizarin in there, it has a tendency to sink in. Burnt sienna has a tendency to sink in. So you could do that, or try and photograph it the same day that you finish the painting while everything's still wet. It can make it a little bit of a challenge to photograph, because then you have a little more glare that you're dealing with, but it can help. You did the painting in 2 sessions, so if that's the case, you could oil it out. Another thing you could do, if you're afraid the painting is still wet, since these are just like studies, you can take like what's called a retouching varnish and spray it lightly over the surface, and it'll bring back some of those true colors, and then photograph it. If you're worried that like brushing on some oil and your painting might still be a little tacky, you can do a retouching varnish. I wouldn't recommend that for a painting that you're planning on selling, or working back into later on. But if you're just wanting to get it, just as a study to submit for homework, then that's one way you can do that too. And that's especially if your painting isn't going to be dry in time for you to like brush on an oil and then photograph it in time for homework, because I know we're kind of on a tight timeline in this class. But I think the glare, like in the hair, I can tell that that's just the color sinking in, so I'm not too worried about that. Do you have any other questions, Angela? All right, perfect. Really nice work, though. I can see how that photo reference printout would have made it a little bit more yellow, but just by adding a little bit of more violet in there, it really balanced out nicely. All right, Susan, are you in here? I know you had mentioned that when you took the picture, you took it with your phone and you felt like it represented the color a little bit better, but I just wanted to ask you if it felt a little yellow to you for how your painting feels in person. And also the value structure. I know you said you felt like the halftones, like the jump between the shadow and the halftones was a little harsh, and we'll talk about that. But how does the overall value and also definitely too yellow. Okay. All right, let me adjust that really quickly. So we will take out some of that yellow. Oops, I'm doing it to the wrong thing. Hold on. There we go. Do you think it has too much red in it, perhaps? I'll probably desaturate it just a touch as well. but you tell me if that feels a little closer. But I think when I bring down the saturation a little bit too. Does that feel a little bit closer? Or if it's still too yellow, let me know. I might be able to play with the hue a little bit. There's a bit more yellow in the forehead. Okay. How's that? I can even punch it up just a little bit more. I might play with the curves a little bit too, because that can bring out some of the color a little bit. Let me reset that. I think just bringing it down just a tiny bit. Still needs more yellow. It looks very yellow on my iPad screen, but I'm looking at my monitor that's streaming and it's looking a little bit. Let me try pumping that saturation back up a little bit. How's that? Is that getting a little closer? And I know it probably, yeah, okay, good. So I'm sure it also depends a little bit on how, like the reference that you're using. Are you like printing it out or are you using a monitor? Because the print, I know that there's a huge difference between printers too. So if your reference when you print it out looks a little bit more kind of yellow than the photo reference here, your printer tends to the purple side. Oh, that's interesting. How does it look compared to the photo reference on here? I'm just curious if it's like really, really different. It looks quite warm compared to it. Okay, that's interesting. Are you compensating a little bit for that when you're mixing? Because right now, when I see the two references here, she feels very, very orange in your painting, and here it's a little bit more on the cool side. So like if I took a sample here from the forehead, and I took a sample here, you can see how those two colors kind of relate. So this is from your painting in the forehead. And this is obviously the photo reference here. Okay, so you're matching strictly to your print. Okay, yeah, all right. So so the photo reference feels quite warm. All right, well, we'll just talk about, I'll talk about a few areas. Overall, she does feel, yeah, it's always a trick to kind of capture. And if you want to, Susan, try taking a picture with your other camera too and send it to me. Just so I can see kind of what the difference is. And sometimes taking one at like a different exposure, like a little bit lower exposure, can help some colors come through more. This is always the trick with photographing artwork. one of the hardest things for me personally to try and do for my website and that sort of thing. Okay, yeah, and try taking maybe some close-ups, and that might help too, because sometimes when we're zoomed out, the camera is trying to balance the high contrast, and it really just tends to favor one or the other. You'll either lose your shadows or your lights will all become kind of oversimplified, and that can be really frustrating when you're trying to, to capture something accurate. I struggle with it with my work quite a bit. And I always end up having to go into Photoshop and tweaking a little bit of the picture as much as I can to get it. And I always do that with the painting right there in front of me on my easel so that I can kind of make that direct comparison to how it actually feels in person. It's always a trick. Okay, so first I wanted to address your question about the transition value from that shadow. You were right, it is a little bit on the harsh side. Yeah, yeah, it's just one of those things that you have to do when you're photographing your work. Unfortunately, where I live, there really aren't that many. I mean, there's not really anyone here who does like high resolution museum quality painting scans of artwork. I'd have to send my work down to Los Angeles to do that because I'm about 4 or 5 hours outside of LA now, and I just do my best to take my own pictures. And I find that even the difference between, I have like 3 different cameras. It's a huge difference. And I find that my Canon actually captures the most accurate color for my work under the light that I work under. So that's what I tend to use when I'm photographing my paintings. The settings on it just happen to capture some of those cooler, more nuanced colors that I tend to lean towards in my work. And I find that when I try and use some of my other cameras, one goes way too red. Just as a tendency, it tends to oversaturate the reds. It just has to do with the different cameras. Oh, of course. No, I would never expect you to do that. Take your work in to have it professionally photographed. No way. Not for this class. Um, but yeah, it's always just kind of one of the things about technology that we have to kind of contend with. Um, but I in keeping that in mind when I give you the critiques and stuff, if you're seeing some of my suggestions and you're looking at it in real life and not seeing that same color, kind of trust your eyes because the cameras do kind of trick us in that way as well. So let's talk about some of those half tones really quickly. So you were saying like you felt like the transition here is a little harsh. So if we go into her shadow here, you can see that she has, it's, there's like a little bit of a break in the form here, but her average shadow, I would say, is somewhere like right in here. So let me start there. So that's hers, and then I'll take yours, which seems really close. It might be a little bit on the darker side. So you can kind of see yours is a little bit on the darker side, and then your transition area is, I think, just maybe too thin. So here's your transition color, and then her transition color. You're very close with that. I mean, the value is pretty good. I think maybe yours just is too thin. And then I think maybe where the next jump, there should be another half tone. It goes a little bit more red, and maybe yours jumps too quickly, too light too quickly. So it probably has to do with somewhere in between those two values. And I'm thinking also it's that this halftone that you have, I would say it's even close enough in terms of hue. This is probably what I would do, is a little bit wider tile, and then I would go into that next value, overlap it just a little bit into that one, and then her pink color is just another value step up. So, and we really only kind of get this on this shadow side. I would even say you could probably use like almost the color you used over here as kind of a middle transition, and just sometimes just widening again that transition a little bit more. Yeah, that's almost too light there. Let me try going a little bit darker. Yeah, maybe something like that. And don't be afraid to like emphasize that cool color within that shadow side. And I'm just gonna leave those tiled, but you can see how that really rounded the form pretty good. Let me catch up with some of your questions. Okay, so you said too harsh, how do you fix that? How do you glaze over the top or go in with full body paint? Okay, that's a good question, because so if you are wanting to go back in, there are a few different ways you could. The time I use the glazing technique is usually if I find that the whole painting feels too bright. That would be a great opportunity to go in when you oil out, to go over that whole area with a glaze. But the problem with just glazing, like let's say you were just going to glaze over this here, right? The glaze is going to, because it's transparent, it would actually darken, like a glaze darkens your darks, and it would actually just emphasize the difference between here and here. Glazes tend to enhance, because they're transparent, whatever's underneath. So if you have a transition that's too abrupt, it's just going to keep enhancing that, and that's not what we want. So what I would do is go in with full-bodied paint. You can oil out, or you could even start by laying down a glaze to have something to paint into if you wanted to. But it's not really necessary. I think in something like this, I would just be mixing a few more tiled values like this, and then I would go in and I would probably oil out, let's say, let me just get a pen. So I would oil out part of the shadow, probably all the way, like this whole section, maybe even down into the chin like here. So that way, as you pull this down, you know, you don't feel like suddenly you have to stop. And then I would tile in this section, then tile in another halftone, and then find a way to transition to that pink that you have there. And it could be a matter of mixing this color with that pink to find something in between. And then, but you oiled out kind of this whole segment, so that way if you have to go back in and paint your highlight on top again, you can. Same thing kind of moving down into here. Though I think your chin looks pretty good. You might need a few more halftones like in this area. But if you're just concentrating on that cheek there, that's how I would kind of approach it. Yeah, yeah. So with oil paint in particular, I think it's a lot easier than some other mediums in terms of like ability to go back in and fix things. Watercolor, you can only do so many layers, right, before the paper starts to wear down. Same thing even with pastel. If you kind of overwork your paper or drawing, you know, it's really, and suddenly the paper starts to tear, then there's not much you can do to fix that. With oil paint, it's very versatile. It is hard to do. It's definitely a challenge when you're first learning how to handle the medium and what ways to kind of approach things. But you can always sand down your painting, like a little bit with like a fine grit sandpaper. Let's say you wanted to rework this whole cheek and you just really weren't happy with it. You could take a very light grade sandpaper, and let's say you had ridges in your paint or something from the previous layer. You could lightly sand this area, even wet sand with a little like linseed oil and a wet dry sandpaper. Just very lightly, you know, abrade the surface, wipe it down with linseed oil, and then retile that whole segment. and it would still feel like it fits in with everything. You don't always have to sand. I only recommend that like if you left something really tiled, or if you have really thick ridges in your paint, you know, you could do that too. But that's how I would fix something like this. I would just go in with more opaque colors and retile. You might find yourself wanting to reapply a thin tile just along this edge of your shadow color, the original shadow color, just so that you have something to blend that edge into. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that, because in the final week 5 and 6, we are going to be repainting back into our paintings a second layer. And you guys can also, I don't think I mentioned this, but you can choose one of these previous studies if you would like to continue it instead of starting a new painting. That's entirely up to you guys. I'm open to that, but you might want to wait to decide until you see some of the new photo references I'll be sending out, which I'll try and get those out probably by Wednesday. I'll try and get it to you guys sooner, but they're all on my hard drive at my studio, and I won't be going there until, I might be able to do it Monday. Let me try and see if I can get it to you Monday, because I want to give you guys as much time, a head start as possible. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, okay, so your values for your average skin tone, I think you're pretty spot on. Other than them feeling maybe a little bit on the yellow side from my view of the picture, I think the value range feels really good. The relationship between the highlight and that average skin tone feels really good. And I like that transition that you have here, right here. I can feel that side plane. That's really, really lovely. So I don't have any other suggestions apart from this section here on that side of the face. So again, just maybe reworking that edge and being aware of some of the violet tones that are reflecting into that side plane, and maybe some of your half tones around the muzzle, if you're wanting to rework the portrait, could be a little bit more nuanced. Shadow, okay, so your question, the shadow of the eyelashes look a little more, oh, okay. Yeah, they are a little bit harsh. A lot of the, okay, so to get them to feel transparent, it's about color temperature and value. So the reason they feel transparent to you in the photo reference is because there is a little bit of light filtering through, and they're, you know, so it, like there's a little bit of light and there's a very soft edge, and they kind of just trail off. So even at their darkest, they're pretty warm. I'm going to just do a little color sample here. So let me do that over this here. So I just took the sample from the photo reference. Okay. And so if we went in and actually made this feel a little bit more like the color that's in the photo, and I would even just have it lighten up a little bit as it trails off. But adding a little more warmth and light into that. So I would maybe take a little cad red into that brown mixture. It should be maybe a little bit lighter than your shadow. And I would say the same thing with your shadow under here. It feels a little bit dark. It's quite dark on her, but there's this red kind of underglow. So you might try taking whatever color you've been using in here and just warming it up a little bit more, adding a little bit of light bouncing into those areas. Even soften up your cast shadow edge a little bit. It's still going to feel really dark, and you'll still need to maybe emphasize just a little bit here, just a little bit there. But some light bouncing into this little edge here, and having a slightly softer edge around that cast shadow. And even on this side, just warm it up a little bit, and then definitely take some of these half tones around it and make it feel a little bit less prominent by kind of tiling around it. And leaving it very, very soft. And then it won't feel like such a harsh kind of color. I know it's very prominent on her too, and there is like a little bit of a sharper edge like right along here, but it still feels, like you said, transparent. So you want to make sure you're using that. And maybe even warm up your form shadow just a little bit on the underplane of the nose. I do see some of that greenish gray color that you were seeing, but I would say warm it up a tiny bit so that it feels like it's more part of that shadow mass. And you might find yourself wanting to retile some of those half tones on the nose too. The nose is such a tiny little space that it's really easy to kind of overemphasize or even make some of those forms a little too like harsh, the transitions. But you can see, like, just by adding a few more tiles, it can make a big difference. And that's kind of how I think of detail anyway. You're just adding like smaller form transitions. You know, when we first block out in this next, so in next week's lesson on our final project, the first pass is going to be much more simplified because we will go back in and add a detail layer. So, and it's not going to be as involved as my previous class, but it'll be like a slightly more developed study. And this is something I would probably do. So we'll talk about how to go back in and adjust those tiles, adjust value structures, adding smaller plane changes and nuances to kind of add it a little more accuracy to the portrait. Does that make sense? Oh, good, good. All right. Well, you did a beautiful job on this study, and I think it sounded like you and a couple of others had a little bit easier time with this one than the previous week. And I know it's a challenging course in the sense of both timeline, but also there's a lot of content we're kind of covering somewhat in depth and rapidly. But it's something that, you know, if you incorporate it, it's kind of like learning to develop like a sketching practice. You know, at first it can feel kind of awkward, but if you start to implement it into your, you know, studio practice, it can help. I forgot to tell everyone a story. When I first was studying, you know, I had classes where we would spend 10 weeks with the model, or, you know, we would have all this time. And then I jumped into a class with Sean Cheatham, who does really amazing alla prima demos, like in like an hour. He'll have like this gorgeous portrait blocked out. But that class was a 3-hour class. We had a live model, right? So we had 3 hours to draw and paint the portrait because the model was not coming back the following week. And I remember the first half of that class, I walked away with pretty much just the drawing, maybe an underpainting if I was lucky. And I think out of the entire 10-week course, I maybe walked away with 2 paintings where I actually finally got to the point where I was blocking out color. But it was really interesting because in the beginning it was like overwhelming to try and do the painting so fast. But towards the end I was actually able to do it. I got faster. I learned how to be a little bit more efficient and not worry about the details. And I think that's what was hanging me up so much in the beginning. So I'm hoping that you guys are going to have a similar experience with this, is that you're really not going to get hung up on the details so much, but really take your focus more to the color and not so much about the likeness. Of course, we always want that too, but it's really about studying the different color and learning about the different skin tones and the theory behind it, so that way you guys can carry it forward into your practice. And yeah, and I remember my husband was with me in that class too, and he had the very exact same experience. It was, we both would walk away and we're like, sometimes we just had drawings that we wiped off because at the end you're like, well, I could just reuse this canvas. So we would just wipe off the drawing. But by the end, we both had produced a few paintings that were actually relatively finished, because we had to learn how to be efficient with our time and not worry so much about making it a masterpiece, but trying to get what we could, down as like taking notes almost of the model. So yeah, so anyhow, glad to share that story. I thought about it after our last lesson, so I wanted to share that with everyone. But great job, Susan. I look forward to seeing your painting next week. Yeah, he's a great teacher. And yeah, it's really fun to watch him demonstrate. All right, so Beth, you are up. And I went ahead and pulled in your close-up. Oh, you're welcome, Susan. And next time, try sending me a couple of different pictures and we'll try. Thank you, Rosalie. All right, so I don't think I pulled in any other pictures, Beth, but thank you for sending the close-up. I picked that one just because I felt like I could see some of the halftones a little bit more accurately, but why don't you go ahead and tell me if the color feels accurate to how your painting feels in real life, or if it needs to be a little bit more on the warm side, because I'm noticing this has more of a kind of a greenish gray hue. So just let me know if you need me to make any adjustments really quick before we get started. And actually, I think I'm going to take this a little bit smaller so I have a little more room for some notes for you. Yours looks more yellow. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna warm that up for you a little bit. We want to take out some of the blue maybe. Oops. How does that feel? Does that feel a little bit closer? I feel like that helped to neutralize the skin tones. Okay, good. All right, we'll go with that then. All right. Really nice job on the average skin tone. I think that looks really, really close. She might be slightly more pink, but let me know if your reference that you're working from, like if you're printing it out or something, if it has a tendency to go that direction. I'll keep that in mind as we're making our comparisons here. So I'm going to take her average. Let me start with the lower one here in the forehead. And then I'll take a similar one here. So you're just feeling maybe a little bit more on the yellow side. So you work from your computer. Is your monitor have a tendency a little bit more yellow? I know mine at the studio versus the one here has a tendency to be a little bit more on the yellow side too. And that's just because my monitor at my studio is calibrated a little bit differently. So often what I find myself doing is I'll edit my picture on that one and then I look at it on every other monitor I have in my house just to see how the color is. That's okay. Let's just keep this in mind. So if you're coming back to this painting and you're wanting to correct it, just you could rewatch this session, and if you're looking at your monitor and you're saying, oh, well, I'm not seeing it that way on my monitor, or I'm seeing it a little closer to how my painting looks, then you can kind of disregard some of the notes and stuff that we're going to go over. Okay, so that's the average flesh tone there. So hers is definitely a little bit more on the pink side, and perhaps a tiny bit lighter, although your color up here seems I'm going to just do those two as your average, because I noticed this one got maybe a little bit on the darker side. So to get from these colors over to here, it would just be an addition of a cooler pink. So maybe adding a tiny bit of alizarin, and maybe a tiny bit of white, because that alizarin might darken that color. That's going to give you something a little bit closer to her flesh tone. I wouldn't say she has really red undertones, but you know, when I was analyzing her skin tone, but she definitely has some cool pink areas that tend to be a little bit more prominent in her skin tone. Okay, so let me take a look here. I think the next one that I would probably suggest is that red, toning that one back just a little bit in terms of the chroma and the purity of that color, that intensity. So if we take your color here, and we take, I'm going to try and find something similar value in that, from that same area. You can see your color is just a little bit more saturated. And, you know, and I think I oversaturated mine a little bit in my painting, and my filming camera does have a tendency to go a little bit more on the red side, and so we have to color correct that one. So again, we're encountering that with the technology a little bit. But I think overall, if you wanted to, if it's looking too rich in your painting in person, you just need to add something to help neutralize that. And I would say probably just an addition of ultramarine blue and maybe a little bit of white. That should do it. If it looks a little bit too red still, you could always add maybe a little bit of yellow ochre and alizarin and see how that does, because that's going to give it a little bit more of that color, because we have a blue, red, and then a yellow. It's essentially taking that color and adding blue. So you can try two different approaches. You can try mixing a fresh color, something like this, with, of course, with white, or you could try changing that color. Just see what feels a little bit more appropriate. I feel like you actually have something very close to it over here. Let me see how that color is, because you might have mixed that one as you were working. Oh yeah, so see how that color is very, very close. And in fact, this one might even be, yeah, you're very, very close to that over here on this side of the face. So if you just implemented some of that color over here instead of that kind of deeper orange, that should work. So if you still have some of these colors that you utilized on this side of the cheek, that could work for the right side as well. Your shadow color could be a little bit on the red side, but I do see that you have this more neutral color. So let me try making a quick comparison of that shadow. So that's her kind of average shadow color. And then I'll pick, you know, I'm having a hard time telling just because the one little area seems more red and one seems much closer. But I would say overall, maybe yours feels a little bit more on the red side in some areas, especially like down in here. So you can just see like those next to each other, how her shadow has a little more green in it. So I think again that would be an addition of ultramarine blue. So to get from there to there, you're going to add ultramarine blue, and I would say a little bit of yellow ochre, because the yellow ochre is going to help lighten it, but it's also going to give it a little bit more green. So you're essentially making a green and adding it to that color. And that's going to give you a little bit more of a close average shadow tone to her skin, and maybe it wouldn't feel so hot. Let me do a little paint over with some of these new colors, and let's just see how they're working. If you just adjusted those minor ones, you might not need to change that average skin tone. So let's see, let me try starting with that shadow. So if we just took out a little bit of the red, you could leave your darker color maybe more red and just have, you know, some of these transition tones a little bit more neutral. And then we took this tone here that you used, which is very similar to the one I was selecting, and we just cooled off this area a little bit. And then I do think you probably could utilize some of this transition tone here. That seems really close to what she has. Yours is maybe a little bit more yellow, but I'll just stick with what you have. But I would definitely carry some of that, maybe up a little higher and back in here, just to build up more halftone. And then maybe take some of this more of the average flesh tone, because it looks like some of the highlight color kind of got pushed around. Maybe even taking that darker average flesh tone that you have and finding other areas that you can incorporate it, like I would say in there. And maybe a little bit more down in here. Or maybe her chin, I think maybe her chin is just a little on the light side, so maybe taking some of the colors that you have in here and just carrying them down into the chin a little bit more. This is often the area where most of us start to lose a little bit of a sense of the value structures that transition from the shadow to the light. We often kind of shorten up that area in terms of, and I realize my brush is softer so it looks more blended, but even if you just tiled in a few more tiles so that way that shadow doesn't have such a harsh transition to the light, then you're going to find that reads a lot better too. And on this side here, this is probably a little dark for that side plane of the nose, but you're in the right kind of hue. I would just say throw in more white, because it should be more of a color shift. It's a slight value shift, especially like when you start getting up into here. But it's just more picking up some of that side plane. You could even take a color from over here and still have it be slightly darker, but it shouldn't be matching the value that you get on this side, because this is the shadow side. So she does get a little bit more of that deeper kind of half tone on this side of the nose. Does that make sense? And do you have any questions? You can actually almost see that color that you mixed down here would be perfect for that side plane of the nose there. So if you have some of that neck color, that kind of lavender that you use down there, that would work really well for that side plane. All right, really nice job. If you do go back in and rework that, I think mostly it's going to be that shadow side that you're kind of editing, bringing down some of the chroma there. Oh, you're very welcome. Nice work. All right, so Jenny, are you in here, Jenny? I know you were having a little bit of a difficult time last time sliding around on the ampersand panels. You could try painting on like a fine linen if you want a little bit more tooth, but the softer brushes can help a lot. I think what you and I had discussed, I think what you were using before was like a hog bristle or something. It was very scratchy, and using like a slightly softer brush or like a synthetic bristle can help. And that's what those brushes that I'm using are supposed to imitate, is like a synthetic bristle, but they're really much more kind of silky and soft for the block-in process. Okay, so before we get started, Jenny, just let me know how the color looks compared to your painting in person. Is it looking too orange, or is it coming across pretty accurate to how your painting feels? It's too bright. Okay. Yeah, let me start by adjusting that. Oops. I keep doing that. Adjusting the wrong layer. Usually when I do that, the saturation goes a little intense too, so I bring that down a little bit. Let me also do the curves. That gives us a little more specific control. How's that feeling? I can try bringing down the brightness further, or maybe the color, oh no, not the color balance, but I could bring down the shadow values a little bit. Is that better? And some of that could be the glare from the panel. Oops. And what about the color temperature? Is that looking pretty good to you? Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, good. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so overall, average skin tones look really good. I think she does feel like a medium skin tone model, even though the photo you said felt a little bright initially. I think that it captured um, her average skin tone pretty good. Let's do just a quick check of that average flesh tone here. Well, let me take yours first, and then we'll take one from a similar area. And then I'm going to take one from below her shadow too, or her highlight. Oops. Yeah, okay. So I'm getting pretty close within the range. So I would say, generally speaking, you have a pretty good like average sense of what her flesh tone is, because I can see you used it elsewhere in the skin as well, and it's feeling pretty close. If anything, yours might have a little bit more yellow in it, but that could just be the camera picking it up a little bit more on the yellow side. I actually think it works pretty nicely. One thing I would suggest is very similar to some of the other paintings we've edited here, is that this halftone here is a little bit on the hot side. So there's your color, and then if I pick something of similar value, you can see it's a little bit on the cooler side. So to get there with your mixture, I would say it would be just maybe the addition of ultramarine blue That's going to darken it though, so you're probably going to want to add some white as well. And that should get it very, very close. It's not that red in the painting. It could be the camera picking up the red a little bit. But just examine that little area and see how it looks in person. It could be the light too, that it's, like I said, some cameras pick up more of the red. I have one camera of mine that makes everything look really, really red. And it can also be the lighting that it's photographed under. If you're having trouble and you're having to use like a indoor light, the camera interacts with that kind of differently. So that could be influencing it too, just slightly. You have some really beautiful halftone colors in here. This purple here is really, really nice. It's probably a little bit more on the saturated side, but I think it complements the rest of her skin tone. So I feel like it helps to balance it out. I'm going to just do a quick paint over here. And I also really like that you have this area like a little bit more, like up here you have this a little bit more green, and then here you have a little bit more of the violet. It's working out really nicely in combination with the other colors. So I would say, namely, what I would suggest is to just re-examine this plane here. And look at where it could cool off just slightly. And maybe a little bit on this side as well. Just a slight, I mean, it's a very small shift, as you can see, but that helps pretty significantly. And then when you get down, like you have all this beautiful cool color down here on this side, but maybe on this side you could use a little bit more right in this area. So if we took an average of this area here, you can see how it picks up a little bit more of like that olive undertone that she has. And whereas on this side it picks up more of that background color. But that would help too in capturing those different color zones. And it's okay to have like a little pickup if you want it just a little bit more saturated. It's not always about being like 100% a copyist in our work, obviously. We want to take some artistic license in that sense. But sometimes if we push it a little far, it makes it not balanced as much. And now that side isn't pulling the eye. Our eyes are drawn to high contrast, sharp edges, and also high chroma, especially if everything else is kind of muted. So my eye, when I looked at this, even though her lips are very saturated, my eye pulled immediately to that cheek. And so those are things that we want to think about. Where do we want to keep the eyes focused in our paintings? You know, with a head and shoulder portrait, it's the eyes and like usually the features, nose, lips, you know, that sort of thing, and everything else can kind of fall away. So by having maybe a more subtle halftone, and maybe even looking at how you could build a deeper value, something somewhat in between the value that you have and that shadow. To create a little bit more of that gradual step, and maybe even in here, finding where you can pull, you know, a little bit more of that gradual value transition. And you could even find an area where you do want to increase the chroma just in that little spot, but maybe it's not so broad. And you can see how that helps to balance it out a little bit more as well. And then maybe down in the chin, she does have those slight pinker colors in a few spots, but I would say overall her chin has a little less of that rosy color, so you could probably just kind of gray that out in general, and maybe have just a touch, like I see just a touch of pink like right in here, and it's really not even that saturated. But if you wanted to enhance it a little bit, you could take some of this pink here and just have a little bit of it at that ball of the chin. But as it pulls off to the left and right of that ball, like over here, you're going to have it more gray, and over here, you're going to have it more of that olive color. Oh, you're welcome, Jody. Thanks for tuning in. All right, Jenny, this was pretty much my only suggestion. Maybe you could look at making that upper lip a little less saturated, going a little bit more kind of like a burgundy violet on that upper lip. Again, it's about finding a neutral and then letting that bottom lip be those colors. And actually, I think you nailed those colors on the bottom lip. It's just that upper one has a little bit more of like a mauve softness to it. And that can help to balance out the painting as well. But I really like your combination of colors. Do you have any questions? Oh, also just in general, as a note, even though her neck is quite pale, this is a great area to look at someone's kind of undertone because the skin doesn't get as much sun there. So sometimes we can see like if it goes more green or if it goes more violet or whatever. But also keep in mind that it gets less light than the face. So it might be a bit darker, than what we anticipate it being initially. And we tend to paint that area very bright because we know it's pale and, we're kind of painting it not as we're seeing it, but as what we think we know the color is. But you can see that the values in here could be a little bit on the darker side. And then where it does get bright is like right in here at the pit of the neck. So are you talking about watching the video for the classes or for our critiques here? Why don't you email me, Jenny, and I might be able to help you figure something out. I don't know what kind of phone you have, but there are ways to kind of get the footage over onto like a larger tablet or a screen using your phone. So maybe we can try and figure something out that might make it a little easier on you. And I know that the website host that I'm working with for hosting the classes, they are currently working on like a watching app for mobile devices and like tablets, which will make it a little bit easier and more streamlined to come in and watch your classes. I don't know when they're planning on releasing that, but I'm hoping it's soon because I think it would be a lot easier than trying to watch it in a browser on the phone. But I hope you do know that you can make it full screen. If you look at when you open up the video to watch it, you can tap like on the video over on the right, you'll see like a full screen mode, and you can actually make it full screen. So if you're working on a tiny device like a phone and you're trying to watch it, you should be able to at least make it full screen on the phone as well. But go ahead and email me, maybe we can figure something out for you. But otherwise, I think you did a beautiful job, and I look forward to seeing your painting next week. Do you have any other further questions? Yeah, and there's going to be like kind of a natural difference between different phones and different monitor colors and the video footage. I need to get back to my emails, but someone had written me and said I'm trying the same mixtures that you're saying in your lectures, but I'm not getting the same results, and that can be either the ratios of the mixtures that can vary widely, but it also could be possibly the monitor that you're watching on might be emphasizing some of the colors other than other ones. And but if anyone's struggling with that and it's really kind of getting in the way, you're welcome to write me, and we'll try and see if we can figure it out some way for you to watch and make it a little bit easier and see a little more accurately. But what's most important is that these concepts are going to translate no matter whether you're painting from life or you're painting in your studio. The way I try to structure the classes is in that way, so that way you can kind of implement this into your studio practice and think about these things as you're working, and realize that there has to be some flexibility in that sense of color mixing. And when I'm talking about these colors too, I know I'm directly referencing the photograph, but I'm also trying to keep in mind that there is going to be some difference between what you guys are seeing, what I'm seeing, my monitor, your monitor, or your print that you're working from. But I'm hoping that these critiques are still helpful in helping you go back and kind of making those comparisons and reanalyzing. I'll come in and even when I'm doing the demonstrations for the class, I'll do, mix a string of colors, and then when I'm actually painting, I find myself reanalyzing that mixture and maybe having to modify it as I'm painting. So that can happen too. Sometimes our initial judgment of those colors is slightly off, and that's okay. That's just part of learning, and then learning to how to adjust it, which colors to add in order to bring it closer to what we're seeing as we're painting. So, okay, well, everyone did a really nice job this week. I think you guys are going to have a lot of fun painting our dark skin model. Does anyone have any general questions before we wrap everything up? And I'll open this up to everyone who's also not in the critiques. If you're just tagging along and watching, feel free to type something in the box, in the chat box, and ask a question. It can be about the upcoming or your new lessons, which I released a little bit early. I released them Friday night, and you guys should have gotten an email about that. That was just because I was busy yesterday. But if anyone has any specific questions that they can think of, please let me know. And if not, then you're welcome to post in the forum. And I know some of you have posted questions, and I'll go through and answer those later on this afternoon. All right, that sounds good. All right, everyone, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the new lessons and your new painting. And you guys know how to reach me if you have any questions. All right, enjoy the rest of your Sunday. All right, bye, guys.